Sorry about that. Welcome again. Brad coming at this from the Democratic side and Alex from the Republican side. Both gentlemen have had extensive public service experience, both in the legislature as well as in the executive branch. And I'll let you read their bios here in front of you. The slides will be made available to you. We are also recording this webinar and web meeting. And if you'd like to have access to either, please contact Paul Miller. He'd be happy to share the links with you. And I guess with that, I will say to Alex and Brad, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're looking forward to what you have to say here.
Hamilton, thank you for having us. Always a pleasure, and certainly lots to talk about. Brad and I are going to try and move through a lot of these slides really quickly so that we can have a fulsome conversation and get to questions. There's a lot of data in here. I'm not going to read it through for everybody, but as Ham noted, we'll make the slides available coming out of this. So let me just briefly kick it off with a review of what the expectation was heading into this midterm election. The entire House of Representatives and a third of the Senate were on the ballot. Democrats had narrow majorities in both chambers, and recognizing President Biden's historically weak approval ratings and history of first midterms, very much an expectation that Republicans would quite easily take the House and at least had the potential to make some headway in the Senate. That, based on both the polling as well as the history, that made a lot of sense. Presidents who are below 50% generally lose about 37 House seats. Obviously, what drove that belief in that was the polls as well. And you can see, generally speaking, slight favorites heading into the Senate and overwhelming favorites heading into the election on the House side. Much has been made about the fact already that the pollsters were wrong in terms of what that looked like. Obviously, Republicans lost a seat in the Senate and only picked up a fairly narrow majority, very narrow majority in the House. I do want to point out one of the key polls is what you see reflected here, the generic ballot, which simply asks voters, if the election was held today, would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat? The final number was Republican plus 2.5. That is actually shockingly close to what the popular vote, if you will, was in this election. So the pollsters really weren't off by very much. Also worth noting, Democrats did not overperform in this election because the pollsters were wrong about President Biden's approval rating. The president is meaningfully and historically unpopular. Being at 40% or thereabouts is not a good place for any incumbent president. So as we head into this new Congress with divided government, it's worth pointing out that broader dynamic stays the same. As we noted, Republicans have squeaked out a very small majority. I think technically we're now up to 219. 218 is what is required for a majority. A lot of the gains that were made by Republicans were in Florida and New York and even California. It was not a national election. You saw very large regional differences in outcome, which I'll speak to as we go through this. The Senate, everyone remembers, was 50-50. We are currently 50-49, pending the outcome of the Georgia runoff. Also important for people to understand, 50-50 meant the Democrats were in control because the vice president can break the tie, and the vice president's obviously a Democrat. Some have said, well, what's the difference? 51 versus 50-50, Democrats are still in charge. There is actually a meaningful difference. Under a 50-50 Senate, with the vice president breaking the tie. The Senate operates under a power sharing agreement between Leader Schumer and Leader McConnell, where Leader Schumer is the majority leader, but things like committees, number of seats on committees, funding, all of those things are effectively evenly divided. Under a 51-49 Senate, when Leader McConnell and Leader Schumer sit down to negotiate committee positions and things like that, that will not be the case. Democrats will have more control than they did under a 50-50, not just because they'll have an extra vote. Gubernatorial elections, we can skip through. I do want to point out one piece here, and it was significant not only in terms of the congressional results, the Senate results, but also looking ahead to 2024. Governor DeSantis in Florida was reelected almost by 20 points, which is the largest margin in pushing 20 years. He also did some, frankly, more remarkable things like flip Miami-Dade County, and in general, overperformed what any Republican is supposed to be able to do in the state, which not only gives him a second term, but very much positions him in the same way that then Governor George W. Bush was positioned heading into the 2000 election. Popular governor, large state, gets reelected, and then immediately rolls that into a presidential campaign. Not that I'm trying to inject myself into the now brewing fight between Mr. DeSantis and Mr. Trump, but it is worth pointing out DeSantis overperformed President Trump's numbers among every demographic in Florida, which shows you the appeal that he has. This is a really important slide for people to take a look at. There's a lot of different ways to look at this election. You can say Republicans took the House. They did. You can say Democrats overperformed and kept that majority really small and actually picked up a Senate seat. Also true. But what is really remarkable to me is how little happened. Republicans won all of the states that Trump won in 2020, and they won Wisconsin. So a net pickup, if you will, of one state. Democrats held 15 of the 16 Biden states and gave up Wisconsin. Georgia could obviously change that, but again, remarkably stable electorate, and shows you, frankly, some of the regionalism that came into play in this election with voters in places like New York, where there was no real threat to abortion rights from the New York State legislature. And Lee Zeldin, who was running for governor, was not a January 6th Donald Trump Republican. Republicans did really well. Go right next door to Pennsylvania. Some of those congressional districts literally border each other, and Republicans got crushed because abortion was in the ballot and a Donald Trump endorsed statewide candidate was in the ballot. And at the end of the day, that was not a particularly effective battleground for Republicans. In terms of turnout, much has been made about whether changes in law or rule in the states, much of it argued as suppressive or potentially suppressive. It doesn't appear to be the case. Nationwide numbers definitely above the historical norm, not quite a record, but strong turnout. And in places like Georgia, which got a lot of that attention, we had record turnout. So just want to make the point about what the very slim majority looks like. I have the number 3 here. I think technically it could still move by 1, but let's call it a House majority of 3. You look back here, you're talking about 1933, the last time someone had to try and operate with a majority that small. Which obviously empowers every individual House member. Their vote becomes even more critical. It's a very tough way to govern. Also, want to point out there has not been a lot of turnover in the Biden administration. There's been no turnover from a cabinet perspective and fairly normal senior staff turnover. I expect that to pick up this year on both accounts. It's just the time, so you will get some new faces. And speaking of new faces, even though 98% of incumbent members got reelected, so if you wanted to run again, chances are you were able to come back, but there were a number of retirements and other things, and obviously flipped seats. There are 84 new members of Congress, including 7 senators and 77 House members, which shows that it is important that on whether it's on postal issues or tax issues or trade issues, you name it, we have effectively, 85 people who've never heard these messages, never been through any of these things, even the last Congress's postal reform. So critical that we get out and continue to educate these folks. On the leadership side, Republicans have selected their slate of leaders. Leader McConnell in the Senate, who survived a challenge, and on the House side, McCarthy, who is the pick to be Speaker, had to survive a challenge from some of his more conservative members. But very important to point out, the actual vote to pick him as Speaker is when Congress comes back. And as it stands right now, McCarthy does not have 218 votes. He has some Republicans who were saying no. Not only did they oppose him at the party level, they will not give him the vote on the floor. So there may very well still be some drama in this regard. That being said, I think the strong bet is that McCarthy is the one who is the Speaker. And on the Democratic side, Brad, you want to speak to the leadership dynamic?
Yes, happy to. As you all may have seen in the news, historic transition of power, generational shift in power in the Democratic caucus, with Speaker Pelosi, Leader Hoyer, and Whip Clyburn stepping out of their current leadership roles and standing by to allow a new generation to come in. All 3 will remain in Congress, which was a bit of a surprise for a lot of us. We thought stepping out of leadership, they would, resign from Congress, but all 3 are staying in Congress. Mr. Clyburn is the only one who's remaining in leadership, albeit a different role. He will be running unopposed for Assistant Democratic Leader. If you recall, that's the position Democrats created in 2010 when we lost the majority and did not want to kick out Mr. Clyburn from leadership. So they created this new position, Assistant Democratic Leader. What that means is the new Democratic leader on the House side, unopposed at the moment, is Hakeem Jeffries. Our elections are November 29th, so when we come back from Thanksgiving is when we'll actually have those elections. But the consensus slate seems to be Hakeem Jeffries of New York as our new Democratic leader, Catherine Clark of Massachusetts as our new Democratic whip, and then Pete Aguilar of California as the Democratic caucus chair. And then what they are doing to resolve the conflict for leadership in caucus position is the Democratic Policy Communications Committee, the DPCC, which is the strategic policy communications arm of the caucus, currently has 4 equal co-chairs. They're moving one of those out, creating a chair, and then 3 co-chairs. And then that chair position will go to Joe Neguse of Colorado. The other change we're making is that where previously Mr. Clyburn, and we were in the minority, the Assistant Democratic Leader position was number 3. They are moving that below caucus chair. So the number 1 Democrat, Hakeem Jeffries, the number 2, Catherine Clark, the number 3, Pete Aguilar, and then the number 4, Jim Clyburn. So those are the changes on the Democratic side. And then, of course, as you all know, our DCCC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee chair, lost his election. Republicans had a huge symbolic win there, defeating Sean Patrick Maloney of New York to a lot of the reasons Alex pointed out. And that battle for DCCC chair will be between 2 Californians, Tony Cardenas and Ami Bera.
Thanks, Brad. Another obviously very significant change that comes along with the change in control in the House is new committee chairs. You can see here we've highlighted the folks who tend to be relevant on our issues. All of these folks have been around for a long time. Kathy McMorris Rogers and Vern Buchanan on Ways and Means, and then Jim Jordan on Judiciary and Mr. Comer on Oversight. One of the, also on the Senate side, since there was no flip, you're going to have, again, because of term limits and other things, some changes in leadership, but again, consistent in terms of folks who understand the issues, been around for a while.
I think the biggest change on the Senate side was Mr. Leahy retiring. Senator Patty Murray will move over to chair Senate Appropriations, leaving her post at the Help Committee, which will be taken over by Bernie Sanders of Vermont. The other key factor, Mr. Leahy was the president pro temp of the Senate. For all you constitutional history buffs out there, that person's technically third in line for president after the speaker. Then it goes to Secretary of State. That person is traditionally the longest serving member of the majority party. Technically, that's Dianne Feinstein. She waived it due to her health reasons, and therefore it falls to Patty Murray. So Patty Murray will be the assistant Democratic leader in the Senate, chair of appropriations, and president pro temp.
And in addition to the potential obligation to serve as president, the president pro tem of the Senate has a ridiculously ornate office overlooking the mall in the front of the Capitol. So I think Senator Murray will enjoy herself. So one of the dynamics with the new majority during the campaign season, you started to hear as it looked more and more clear that Republicans were favored to bring the majority back in the House. They started laying out what they called the Republican commitment to America, which sounds a lot like the contract with America that then incoming Speaker Gingrich rolled out. I don't know why they can't come up with some more innovative branding. And they highlighted what they planned from a broad perspective to focus on, some of which we will care about, a lot of which we will not. Hunter Biden and his laptop are at the top of this list for a reason. It's because Mr. Jordan and Mr. Comer and others who will be in more oversight focused roles have said we want to get to the bottom of it and dig through it. Similarly, the border, crime, Mr. Fauci, and COVID origins. I think that anyone connected to Mr. Fauci or to Hunter Biden can probably reserve a full-time parking space in front of the Capitol because they're going to have to go to a lot of hearings. Similarly, going after the Biden administration on Afghanistan withdrawal, focus on China, ESG, woke capitalism, and culture wars. ESG and issues around what's being called woke capitalism are going to get a lot of attention from the new House Republican majority in terms of chastising both people promoting ESG related regulation like the climate disclosure, as well as companies appearing to engage and make business decisions driven by political issues or social issues. And then lastly, big tech and online speech. I'm old enough to remember when big tech had lots of friends on one side and then everyone on the other side hated them and then they flipped. And now they frankly have problems with everybody, whether it's on antitrust issues or on censorship or speech or Mr. Musk's behavior at Twitter. Big tech in general is going to get a lot of scrutiny, as is anything that is China related. Whether it's on export control, technology transfer, espionage, forced labor issues, whether TikTok is stealing everyone's children's data and showing it all to the Chinese, all of those issues, in addition to the more pedestrian, from their perspective, trade issues, where President Biden has largely kept a lot of the Trump administration's tariff regime in place. All of those are going to get a lot of focus in the new Congress. Brad, anything you want to just add on that piece? I mean, obviously that the Republicans are going to get to control the agenda in the House. Democrats still have the Senate. I think they have a slightly different set of issues they want to talk about.
Yeah, I think the biggest problem we're going to see with whoever is leading the Republican caucus in the House or the House's Speaker is going to be their ability to govern with such a slim majority. The Republicans have long criticized and accused Speaker Pelosi of abusing proxy voting in order to maintain control of a very narrow margin. Kevin McCarthy or whoever is Republican Speaker is almost assuredly going to end proxy voting, which makes legislating very, very difficult. What I imagine is with a growing base of the Democratic Party that is becoming more and more to the far right, and it just doesn't want to see a lot of things passed. What you're going to see is a rise and a refocus on the moderate Democrats, the Blue Dog Coalition, the New Democrats, and the Problem Solvers Caucus as the grease to the skids of government. So at a certain point, when the House passes something, it's going to go to the Senate where Chuck Schumer is going to put his imprint on it and send it back. At that point, whoever is the Speaker is going to have to decide, do I pass this with bipartisan votes or with just Republican votes? I think the latter may be very difficult. I say all that to say this process is going to be very tenuous over the next 2 years. The only things that are going to become law are going to be bipartisan. And on top of that, it's going to require a lot of due diligence, a lot of negotiations. I would anticipate very few non-elective things becoming law. I think we're just going to be focusing on all the must passes, funding the government, the Defense Authorization Act, the Intel Authorization Act, the Farm Bill. Those are going to be the big items next Congress because those are the must passes. Anything elective is really going to struggle to survive next Congress.
Yep. Indeed.
And I think the two consequences of that, to Alex's point, number one will be Republicans only have the gavel in the House. Since they won't be able to legislate, they're going to turn to hearings in order to really kind of make their mark. Secondly, with the Biden administration going to have a very difficult time trying to pass things, I would see a rise in executive orders from the White House. Like those are the two big consequences of divided government.
Yep. So I want to pivot a little bit away from the election and what happened and what the consequences in terms of leadership and committees, and walk through some of the key specific issues that we care about, and where they are and what the impact is likely to be. And Ham, obviously, jump in on any of this. This year, I'm already looking ahead. This year, the president signed postal reform, which was a huge victory broadly to get done. People on this Zoom understand more than almost anyone in America how challenging that was to get over the finish line, much less with bipartisan majorities. That being said, there's a lot both that came out of that and didn't get addressed by that still very much needs to be affected, in particular, the price increases. These are massive numbers at a time that both from an industry as well as a macroeconomic perspective are extra challenging. And while we will continue to work with Mr. Connolly and members of the Oversight Committee around some of the legislation like HR 8781 in this new Congress, we are also going to have to really make sure we dig in, whether it's oversight or judiciary, and drive these conversations in a way that makes sure that the pressure that everyone is under in terms of the rate increases, that they address it, and whether they address that legislatively or whether they are able to bring pressure to bear on the postmaster and others. Either way, we have a lot of work to do in this upcoming Congress on postal issues, notwithstanding the fact that we're on the still just in the afterglow of the largest piece of postal reform legislation being signed into law in a long time. Ham, anything to add on that?
I think one of the things, if you haven't already reached out your congressional delegation and asked them to support Mr. Conley's, what is it, fairness, go back one slide, please, fairness in postal rates,
Ensuring
accuracy in postal rates. I don't think there's any real feeling that we'll get 87, 81 into law in the lame duck. But if we have a strong showing of bipartisan showing of co-sponsors, that is going to be a forcing mechanism to have through moving bills consider putting it on and passing the requirement for a second review. The Appropriations Committee did pass a law that they put in report language, not in the law itself, asking the PRC to do a study on what the impact of postage increase was. This would be even stronger and say to the PRC, you must start again and look at what decisions you made and subsequent events and how we're going to respond to them. So for everyone in the industry hurting on what has been enormous rate increases and more to come, it looks like, this is what we really have to focus on, see if we can get some support for this bill.
Thanks, Sam. Next, the sales tax. Look, I can't emphasize this enough. After Wayfair decision came out of the court, there were a lot of folks who were like, Congress doesn't want to talk about this, doesn't want to deal with this. In the wake of the court case, that was obviously not an option from our perspective. And I'm really proud of the work that ACMA and the tax committee in particular did this year. Number one, they were able to push for a hearing in Senate Finance, which, among other things, not only directly addressed the issue, but also included ACMA member testimony. And then last week, GAO published a report again, laying out some of the uncertainties and pointing out that businesses face continued substantial compliance costs and uncertainty, with some recommendations for Congress to stepping back in to guide the states. As noted, that was a direct result of our advocacy this last Congress, and it's going to continue to be a priority this year. It is not yet clear, but certainly my expectation that while that, tax bills are never an easy conversation. It's probably an easier conversation with an anti-tax Republican like Vern Buchanan on the House side, and we'll certainly endeavor to make more meaningful progress this Congress. But given the dynamic, I actually think a lot was done in this last year.
Yeah, I just want to accentuate that. We went from get out of my face, not interested, it's not an issue that people care about, to not only a hearing, but we've had some discussions with certain offices around specific legislation, some advanced discussions about what's in there. And then the GAO report, which the GAO, Government Accountability Office, is considered a neutral third party that works for Congress. People said, well, okay, ACMA, we hear what you're saying, but is that really true? And so the GAO report says, yes, it's really true. This is wasteful and needs to be corrected, and Congress needs to step up and take responsibility to regulate interstate commerce and clarify the rules of the road. So this was, in addition to the postal victory, this was another enormous victory for us, enormous progress moving down the field of play considerably. And I wouldn't say we're in the red zone yet, but we're certainly headed towards it, and we're going to keep the pressure up. And again, shout out to our tax committee and the great work that those folks have been doing at hundreds of calls at this point, and really helpful stuff.
Yep. Thanks, Ham.
You had an earlier, if I just step back,
Yeah.
You had an earlier slide that oversight was going to spend a lot of time investigating. And it's interesting, we've had some good conversations with Mr. Comer, and he is, in my judgment, more moderate, but I think he's very concerned about keeping the more extreme pieces of his party in line. And I think he feels like he has to do some of this investigation stuff before he can expect to have anybody's attention on actually governance. But my sense is policy and governance is what he cares about. And I think he's rational. So I'm not giving up on getting some progress on postal issues. I should also point out that there's an opportunity to correct some of these postal issues through executive action. And Brad talked earlier about the more likelihood of greater executive action. So I'm not quite as despondent as I might be otherwise. And then my last point is I'm hoping that we can see bipartisan consensus starting to emerge on some common sense things that I think most Americans feel need to be done. And where it's not an extreme position, we can actually just do some basic blocking and tackling that should improve the overall business landscape as well. So those are all yet to be seen. And hopefully my prediction is an accurate one, but maybe not. We'll see.
No, thank you, Ham, and I agree. That's certainly the goal, and hopefully an attainable one. Sorry about that. Just a couple other policy issues I want to touch on. One is federal privacy legislation, which has been now knocking around 9 different committees at various points in its life. This last summer, House Energy and Commerce actually advanced a bill on a bipartisan basis. Worth noting, then ranking member McMorris Rogers is going to be the chair this next Congress. She's endorsed it, as is Mr. Wicker on the Senate side. There was not unanimous support across the body. Senator Cantwell didn't like it. Pelosi didn't love it. Schumer has said he would support legislation that has, effectively 4 corners backing. It's going to be a different world come January. Pelosi will not be there as speaker. McCarthy has generally supported a framework of federal privacy legislation, hasn't gotten specific because he didn't have to. The issue obviously continues to grow as more states have new laws that are coming online, which will require compliance and justify the federal engagement. So we're going to continue to play on that. And then lastly, from a policy perspective, the trade issues. As I noted earlier, much to many people's concern, the Biden administration has largely kept the Trump tariff regime in place. And for a fairly long period of time in the last year, there wasn't even a process within USTR to look at these issues and to seek continued relief. They have now officially opened a public comment period for their Section 301 review. That being said, I don't actually think the public comment is what's going to drive those next steps. It's really the macro U.S.-China relationship. Ambassador Tai, who's the U.S. trade rep, recently met with her counterpart. No specific sign of tariff relief. And so this is going to continue to be an issue. These are now, the Biden administration collected the Trump administration, who started this round of tariffs, collected $77 billion. Biden's administration has now collected $83 billion. I say that not because the numbers themselves matter, but to point out this administration, it's the one place probably where there has been remarkable consistency between administrations. Again, driven partly by economic factors, but really by the larger U.S.-China relationship. I'm somewhat hopeful, having held the line for 2 years without really saying anything, either to Congress or to the business community, that USTR is at least going to have a process back in place for effective and efficient exclusions for folks to try and get some relief.
And I think, to Alex's point there, some of that is I think the Biden administration was hoping to use these tariffs as leverage in some of their trade talks for a broader deal with China. That seems to be, as of course we all expect, taking much longer than anticipated. Combined with the Ways and Means Committee, which provides oversight to USTR, has been very deferential to Catherine Tai, as she is a former Ways and Means staffer. We worked together when my former boss was on the Ways and Means Committee through USMCA negotiations. So there's not been a whole lot of willingness to prod the ambassador along. I suspect a Republican-led Ways and Means Committee will. However, it's unclear how anti-China the Republicans on Ways will go if they view any rollback of these tariffs as pro-China. There may be added pressure from the Republican caucus to keep these tariffs in place. It's just a matter, we're going to very closely monitor the membership that gets placed on the Ways and Means Committee and who wins that gavel.
Yep. Thank you. Up next, Congress is actually back. It's quite entertaining to see new members going through orientation. Not as entertaining to see those members who were on their way out packing things up. And they will have this brief legislative period known as the lame duck. Now, historically, from a perception perspective, people think, oh, nothing gets done in a lame duck. They're here for a couple of weeks. A bunch of the people are about to retire or they lost their election. So there's not going to be a lot of motivation to get things done. Actually, both the current situation and history indicate that's wrong. Lots of stuff happens during lame ducks. Because Congress loves being bumped up against a deadline, and B, a whole bunch of people, either because they're retiring or they lost their election, they're suddenly liberated to vote in ways they weren't comfortable voting before. So lame ducks can absolutely be productive seasons from a legislative perspective. Brad, do you want to just walk through what we think that looks like?
Sorry, what in particular?
The must pass pieces. Obviously, the government funding, NDAA. Just walk through what we think is likely.
Sure. The two leading things at the moment, the two biggest, largest vehicles, the National Defense Authorization Act, which authorizes the Pentagon to do everything. So as you know, this is different from appropriations, which is what the omnibus, we talk about omnibus. So you have to authorize a program and then you have to appropriate money. So the NDAA authorizes the Pentagon to do everything they do. So critical must pass piece of legislation that is by far more towards the goal line than the omnibus appropriations package. At the moment, the House and Senate committee, armed services and on both sides are working out common language. They will hopefully have that to the House next week, as we're hearing. And then by early December, the House will repass the NDAA as amended, kick it to the Senate. The Senate will straight up or down vote, pass it. As a reminder, no matter who has the gavel in the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass anything. So it's got to be bipartisan. Hence, while we're renegotiating the NDAA, that will go to the president to sign, hopefully before Christmas. And the big must pass is the omnibus appropriations bill. This funds the government. The current continuing resolution expires on December 16th. My guess is they may extend that another week to give them some time to finish, which puts us right at Christmas, which is classic Nancy Pelosi to urge folks to get along. And then all the stuff below are these one-off things that are showing some momentum. So the legislation to codify same-sex marriage, the Senate will pass as soon as they return. And then the House has already passed it, but the Senate made some changes. So they'll kick it back to the House, which will almost assuredly pass it. President will definitely sign that in early December. Obviously, we're going to continue judicial confirmations, hurricane relief from the hurricanes that hit Florida and the Southeast, combined with Ukraine aid funding. The White House has requested additional funding for Ukraine. I think there's a lot of concern that maybe a Republican House won't fund it as much. So Democrats are trying to get that done. Those may ride the omnibus appropriations bill, including some cannabis tax extenders or permitting reform. Those may also ride. There's also a chance all of this gets put together into one very, very large bill at the end of the year. It just depends on how these bills are being debated and amended and moved along. So I think the first one you're going to see the president's desk will be the same-sex marriage legislation, then NDAA, and then whatever's left will probably get combined into one very large bill.
And Brad, I assume you share my view, but obviously if you don't, say so. The government funding While we may very well come right up to the deadline, as we usually do, I am not expecting a government shutdown this time.
No, and if this goes, if y'all quite remember, the 117th Congress started in the middle of a shutdown, or excuse me, the 116th Congress started in the middle of a shutdown. If need be, Pelosi will keep them there through the holidays to January 2nd. They have until January 2nd to pass this. On January 3rd, when the new Congress gets sworn in, they have to start all over. And so they will work through the holidays. Both McConnell and Pelosi are appropriators. There's almost, in my opinion, a 0% chance of a shutdown.
Yeah, there's some bipartisan agreement for everyone's holiday season.
And never, as the saying goes in Washington, never underestimate the power of the smell of jet fumes.
Yes.
For people wanting to fly home.
A question: I would have expected in the lame duck, now that the election is passed, that there wouldn't be the bickering between D's and R's. And I was sitting in a hearing last week, and it was just dominated by, well, not dominated. There was a lot of bickering. I was really surprised. What's the dynamic? Is it an easier environment to get agreement on things in the lame duck, or people still trying to score points?
So, Ham, here's what I would say about that. Some people are very much still eager to continue fighting. Some people are fighting because they're trying to line things up for January, or because they know they're not going to be in a good position in January and they want to get it done like crazy. The real opportunity in the lame duck tends to be with the members who are retiring or lost their election, and are going to be, going back to wherever they're from. They are very liberated, and so Senator Toomey and Portman, for example, are two who come to mind. Definitely worth watching how they vote here at the end, because that's usually where the opportunity presents itself. For everyone else who's hanging around and coming back, no, sadly, they usually do want to keep fighting.
And I'll add real quick, probably the most consequential item on your screen, and for the long term and health of the democracy, is the Electoral Count Act. There seems to be rapidly growing bipartisan support for this, which would essentially help prevent what happened on January 6th and very clearly state the role of the vice president in that process. So that's definitely one to monitor. It would be super critical to focus on. Trump's intervention in this legislation will be one to watch as well.
Yep. So, look, pivoting over to ACMA's priorities in the 118th Congress, no matter what industry you're in, if you have government as a customer, if you are regulated by government, if you have to interact with a quasi-government monopoly, all of the above, trade associations, which is the role ACMA is playing here, are integral in shaping those policy outcomes. Members, be they new members or old members, absolutely look for input. Believe me, you all understand the issues that are affecting your businesses far better than members of Congress, even those who have jurisdiction, and support for worthwhile efforts from trade associations are really important. If you don't have that voice, that engagement, it's very hard for companies to influence that narrative, to understand that narrative, and fundamentally, are just at sea, at risk from any of those policy headwinds. And the other piece of it is that engagement also provides knowledge and understanding on where those policy conversations are heading, and from my perspective, allow companies to plan and work through those as easily as possible. And look, having worked with many of you and ACMA for a long time, I think ACMA is absolutely, because of those efforts over a long period of time, which is what it takes, is recognized on the Hill and in the administration as educated, effective, and meaningful voices across these spaces. So, Ham, I don't know if you want to add to that. happy to answer questions about any of this as we head into the new Congress.
It's going to be critical that all of our members deepen their relationship with their members of Congress. And as you heard earlier, it's every vote matters. And we haven't been in a situation like that in a while. So if you have that personal relationship and that trust, they're going to think long and hard about disappointing you. And they need your input, but they also need your support. So I would encourage everyone on this call, but also across the industry, to be aggressive in building a relationship. If you need any help doing that, we will help you. My hope is that we're going to come to you and have action items to follow up on that are meaningful, such as joining Conley's, getting your delegation to join Conley's bill for a co-sponsor. I think there'll be several of those opportunities coming up in the next 2 years, and that deep relationship that you maintain is going to be invaluable to us.
Yeah, absolutely. Questions on any of this?
I'm just going to say we haven't had much in the way of questions. It's just been a great overview, but maybe there's some questions out there, particularly tough ones for our esteemed panel to comment from both the R or D perspectives. You can just hit the reaction button. You'll see an opportunity to raise your hand, and we'll recognize you, or you can type it into the chat box, whichever you prefer. Just give you a moment to do that.
And while we're giving folks that opportunity, I will just preemptively address one of the questions I've gotten a lot in the last week or so of doing these, which is what happens with Donald Trump's presidential run? Truthfully, I have no idea how this goes, but it is worth noting that when President Trump ran the first time, there was a very large field of Republicans who ran against him, didn't take him seriously, tried to understand how to navigate him during the campaign and failed miserably. It's a different season this time. Many of those people, both who ran against him last time and people like Governor DeSantis, who I think is likely to run against him this time, they don't view him the same way. And they're not going to just get out of the way or take the drubbing that he handed out. I also think the media is not going to cover him necessarily the way he was covered last time, which will make it more challenging for him to get his message out. I won't pretend to understand his motives for running. That may be beyond just wanting to reoccupy 1600 Pennsylvania, but I think they're probably complicated given where he is in terms of investigations and other things. But I will say, I think it will be very challenging for him to actually secure the Republican nomination. I think the road is a lot more open for others, not just Governor DeSantis. I think there's probably 15 or 20 potentially credible folks who may get into this race.
Do we have any new leadership potentials on the Democratic side? I think we have some on the Republican side. And do you have to be 70 plus years old to serve in leadership in the US, or are we going to bring some younger folks in?
Well, I think some of the best Democratic presidents we've had have been the younger ones. You look at Mr. Obama, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. Kennedy. So I think the problem is that, first of all, I think a lot of Democrats are happier now than they were a year ago with Mr. Biden's presidency. He has had a string of legislative accomplishments on everything from climate change to gun safety, which have been huge, bold reforms, infrastructure that Democrats have been fighting for a very long time. So I think they are very satisfied with his performance as president in terms of legislatively. I think obviously there's some charisma issues, and he's done great against Putin with NATO. We've been very pleased there. I think obviously his age is a complicating factor. Makes us a little nervous as Democrats heading into what's going to be a very vigorous election for president. I think the problem is that most Democrats aren't excited about a Kamala Harris nomination. I think we're very worried that she would lose against many of the Republican options. And so the president stepping aside would open up a primary. And I think the temptation to nominate the first Black woman as president is too much of a appeal for Democrats to nominate anybody else. So I think the concern from a lot of party operatives is if Biden steps aside, the nomination goes to Kamala, to Ms. Harris. And if Ms. Harris is the nominee, we will almost assuredly lose, is the conventional wisdom in the party. So I think while Democrats may be frustrated with some of Biden's days as president and his age, they are fully committed to his renomination and urging him to stay on. And so that's part of the calculation you're seeing among Democrats, particularly. I think the rise of Trump helps solidify Biden's position as our nominee heading into 24.
Don't you have that same dynamic in 6 years with Harris?
Yeah, but we have no choice in 6 years. Biden has to step aside. So, but yeah, hopefully by then we will have a bench. And I'm looking at candidates like Wes Moore, the new incoming governor of Maryland, is fantastic. He's a great speaker. He's got a great family. He should have an easy time as legislating the first 2 years as governor. And so he's one to watch. I think you look at Gretchen Whitmer in Michigan, who has done a terrific job leading that. Gavin Newsom is hanging in the wings in California. So there is a growing bench, but I think with Kamala being the sitting vice president and Biden stepping aside, they're not ready yet to kind of build an operation to take her on. And I think the nomination goes to her. And I think that's what has a lot of Democrats nervous. In 6 years, these people will raise their national profiles.
The other thing that's worth pointing out, because it gets asked a lot, what if the president says, yeah, I'm running, and one says, great, I'm going to challenge you. It has happened, not just on the Democratic side. It happened with Ted Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. It happened with Ronald Reagan and Jerry Ford. It doesn't happen successfully. In almost all of those cases, what does happen is it's very damaging to the party in an election season, and that person ends up pulling back and waiting their turn for the nomination next time anyway. And
in both those challenges, the party where the president was challenged, they lost that cycle.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, it is really challenging and divisive. And so one of the things that I'm watching is, as the president's numbers stay low, one of the perception issues is, well, he may be the right guy against Trump, but he may be the wrong person against everyone else. And if it looks less likely that Trump's the nominee, it'll be interesting to see whether a Pete Buttigieg or some of the others who have been talked about decide they don't want to be patient and now is their moment. But again, it tends to end badly for the party.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And there's a lot of Fox News mentions of the return and rise of Hillary Clinton. I assure you that is not ever going to happen.
She's getting an age as well. Okay, a last call on questions before we move on. I don't see any hands raised. You guys have covered the waterfront well, and it's going to be exciting. Talk about exciting. How about saving $500 on your forum registration this year? If you've enjoyed this discussion and you haven't been to the ACMA forum, you are treated to a much deeper dive in all of these topics, as well as interacting with the decision makers themselves in Washington. And it's really an interesting event, to say the least. We've gotten really strong reviews from those that have attended. We are trying to get a lot of people there, so I would ask all of you to please register and take advantage of this opportunity, but also to bring a friend or talk it up within the industry and get more people there. And let's make sure that we have a really good event on May 1st to the 3rd in 2023. I do expect there will be, as Alex would say, a live fire exercise in terms of legislation we care about that is being debated. We will likely go on the Hill and do some lobbying as part of that. and it really will be a great event. So please join us and talk it up and get others there as well. And I think, is there one more slide, Alex?
Let's see here. Nope.
No. Okay, very good. So there we go. Quick overview, trying to make some sense out of the nonsense and setting the table for what's to come in the next couple of years. Thank you so much for your support and your involvement. Please get others involved. There is strength in numbers in Washington, and we can make a difference, but we must all put our shoulder to the wheel to make that happen. So thank you for joining us on this webinar, and have a great weekend and happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all.